In this module, we're going to be learning about how stress affects the brain. And I think it's going to be a really powerful lesson for you. So let me show you parts of the brain that we want to talk about. We want to talk about this amygdala, which is right here. So this is the amygdala, and then this is the hippocampus. So maybe you remember from the past that the amygdala seems to be involved in emotional processing. However, I do want to say that emotions are not localized. They're all over the brain, and this seems to be more involved in just kind of giving the intensity to emotions, or it seems to be heavily involved in an aspect of a particular emotion. It's not that like fear is in here and rage is in here. You have to have a whole variety of input. So there are certain nuclei, which are clusters of cells that seem to be more involved in the processing. However, it's important to know that emotions are constructed and that you have to have many different inputs and many different factors involved in order to have an emotional experience. And this is important to know that something doesn't just trigger an emotion. We actually make emotions. So anything that happens to us is processed. It doesn't just trigger emotion, it's processed. And by knowing that information, we can understand that we have some control over our emotions. So, this part of the brain, when it's heavily activated, the amygdala, it seems to shut down the frontal lobe. So, the frontal lobe is an area of the brain that controls our judgment, our logic. It makes us act socially acceptable. It allows us to see the big picture. But when this starts getting activated right here, it kind of turns this off. And you just go into survival mode. Like, I'm just going to survive. You don't see the big picture. You focus on a very narrow range, and your access to all your thought processes are kind of shut down. It shuts down your ability to access all of this. And since this is firing so much, and this is the hippocampus, which is your memory structure, this is what kind of accesses. So all of your memories are up here in the cortex, and this is kind of what accesses it. So, like, if you can imagine, this is like your hard drive of your computer, and what this is this is the keyboard that can get into the files. So I want you to imagine that your keyboard is kind of malfunctioned. So now you can't get a hold of all your different files. You're just stuck on this right here. So you could kind of think of like stress as this virus that kind of shuts this down. So what happens is when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, the amygdala is heavily activated. And when the amygdala is heavily activated, you just go into this survival mode, and it shuts down your access to the cortex. But when you become more relaxed, you can see things from a different light because now you have access to the different pathways in the cortex. So some of you may have experienced this. This term here that says emotional hijacking. You study for a test. You know everything on the test, but you're nervous about it. So then, as soon as the teacher lays the test on the desk, it's as if all of the information just went poof, it's gone. Because what happens is when you get stressed out, you stop thinking rationally, and this starts getting activated, and you no longer have access to the cortex. And that's what's going on with people who have serious test anxiety. But another thing is how many of you, myself included, how many of us have done things when we're angry or stressed that we really regret? And you're like, oh my goodness, what was I thinking? And so what happens is we do things under stress. We make terrible mistakes under stress because this gets activated heavily, and we don't think about the consequences of our actions. So there's this old story that I always tell about. It's the white Mercedes case, where supposedly there was this. They were two she was a dentist, and I believe he was a dentist. I believe both of them were dentists. So very stable people, and but he had a sex addiction, and she had gone to therapy with him, and they had tried. She had even gone to get some plastic surgery to see if that would work. She had really gone out of her way and to try to fight his sex addiction, but it was getting to her. And so one day, again, remember, she's not a killer or anything like that. Well, one day she follows him and she finds him, sure enough, in a hotel room with someone else. And she actually happened to have her stepdaughter, his daughter, in the car with her, following him. And she goes in there, and I guess it was the final last straw. And she sees him in there, and he comes out and says, "Oh, what's happening?" And she's driving, it's called the white Mercedes case, and she's driving a Mercedes and she runs over him, and then she backs up back over him. Then there's other cases where maybe a long time ago you would have the famous astronaut and diapers case, where there was this woman and she was an astronaut, which, as many of you know, like, to be an astronaut, you have to be very high up. Your personality has to be very stable. I mean, to be an astronaut is a very large accomplishment. But she was in love with another astronaut, and he was starting to see another woman, and she found out about this, and she was in Texas and he was in Florida. And so the story goes that she put on diapers so that she would not have to stop to go to the bathroom, and she drove from Florida to Texas. She had tubing in her glove compartment, and her intent was to go and attack his lover. And you say, "Oh my goodness, what was she thinking?" But here it is. When this gets activated, it shuts down your ability to produce any logic. And I'm sure you've heard story after story on the news, and you're saying, "Gosh, what happened there?" Now, a lot of times people will come to me and they say, "Well, you know what, Amy, she drove from Florida to Texas. You're not going to tell me that that was, an emotional hijacking. It was, premeditated." But here's the thing, and I think this is so important to learn about other people, is when people are upset and this is activated. Remember how I told you in lecture, I was like, okay, the activation of the sympathetic nervous system is like a light switch. It's like your brain processes something as being stressful, and it switches on those lights. It's just like shoo right down that chain of ganglia. But then the parasympathetic nervous system seems to work like a dimmer switch, and each different organ gets turned down slowly. So our thoughts seem to, once this amygdala goes up, it takes a while to come down. You might want to time yours. When you get upset one day, maybe you could stop and say, "You know what? I'm going to take a break from everything. And I want you to set a timer and see how long does it take you to calm down." I think you might find it takes like 15 or 20 minutes. So why is this so important when dealing with other people? Is I think it's important to know that when you start fighting with somebody, like verbally fighting with somebody, or somebody's really, really upset, their amygdala has definitely taken over, I think you need to understand that they can't be logical. They can't be logical. And I hear a lot of times in classes people say, "Oh, but I told them I was sorry and they just couldn't stop. They were just mad, but I kept telling them I was sorry." But the thing is it's not a light switch. The amygdala doesn't work as a light switch. So when you say "I'm sorry," it's not going to just stop the amygdala. The amygdala needs time. And this is so important to know, that when someone's really, really upset, the best thing that you can do is give space. When I teach the sexuality class, I tell my students, I think that a really good idea is you don't fight for more than 10 or 15 minutes. You know how sometimes the verbal fights go on and on? I think it should be like you set a timer, like, okay, we're going to fight about this for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to discuss it, but then we're going to just take a break because this needs time to come down so that you can access all your pathways. Another thing is so that this can cause you to, there used to be an old show, it was called Snapped. And what this show was about is it was about people that were just regular, ordinary people. And then for whatever reason, one day they just snapped and did heinous crimes, kind of like what I told you about the astronaut in diapers or the white Mercedes case. Um, and so this is snapping. Your amygdala just takes over, shuts down all your logic, and makes you snap. Um, but another thing that it does is long-term stress seems to shrink the hippocampus. So when you've been under long-term stress, this becomes overactive and this doesn't allow this to function, so it severely impacts your memory. Then another thing that we see with mental disorders, many of the mental disorders, like a hallmark of them, is a shrunken campus. A shrunken hippocampus. So we see it in depression, we see it in schizophrenia, we see it in post-traumatic stress disorder. So it seems like when this gets activated too much, it shrinks the hippocampus, or maybe they had a natural tendency for their hippocampus to shrink. But this, the psychosomatic illnesses that go with this are mental disorders and anxiety disorders and depression. All your mental disorders tend to be exacerbated by stress. Even your paraphilias, your sexual acting out, all of this is exacerbated by stress.